In 1590, an English ship returned to the colony of Roanoke after 3 years of silence. The settlers were gone. No bodies, no signs of battle, no graves, only a single word remained. Carved into the wood, Croatoan. But what really happened to the lost colony of Roanoke? England, 1587. The docks of Plymouth Harbour were a thunder of voices, sails, and salt. Crates of seed, muskets, nails, and barrels of salted pork filled the piers. Among the crowd, John White, now grey at the temples, but sharp-eyed as ever, watched as 3 ships, Lion, Roebuck, and Flyboat, readied for sea. Beside him stood his daughter, Eleanor Dare, her hands resting on her rounded belly. She was 6 months pregnant, the first Englishwoman to sail across the Atlantic to bear a child in the New World. White turned to her uneasily. "Are you certain, my dear? The seas are long, the land unkind." Eleanor smiled softly. "Father, if England can find a home there, so can I." Her husband, Adanias Dare, stood close, proud and determined. Around them bustled more than 115 settlers, artisans, carpenters, farmers, mothers, and children. They weren't soldiers like before. They were dreamers. Music greater than the Queen's patent gave them the right to form a self-governing English settlement. The investors saw profit in furs, timber, music, and trade. But for many of these men and women, Roanoke was more than business. It was a promise of freedom, a clean slate from the debts and hierarchies of London. The fleet raised anchor on May 8, 1587, bound once again for the mysterious shores of Virginia. The voyage across the Atlantic, the crossing, was punishing. Weeks of grey horizon, creaking timbers, and cold salt spray. Storms ripped sails, rats infested grain, and disease whispered through the holds. Yet each morning, when the sun broke through the clouds, the settlers gathered on deck singing psalms, praying for deliverance. The mood was hopeful. Their captain, Simon Fernandez, was an experienced Portuguese navigator and, as it would turn out, a dangerous man. He was known among sailors' music as the Swine for his temper. White distrusted him deeply. They were supposed to establish the colony near Chesapeake Bay, where conditions were safer and food more plentiful. Riley's orders were clear. Roanoke was to be avoided, its soil too sandy, its tribes too wary. But fate or Fernandez had other plans. Arrival at Roanoke. On July 22, 1587, the ships reached the Carolina coast. White's heart sank when he saw it. The narrow strip of sand, the endless pine forest, the haunting familiarity of Roanoke Island. He argued with Fernandez to continue north to Chesapeake, but he refused. He claimed the season was too late, the winds too strong. He ordered the settlers ashore at Roanoke and left, promising to return later. White watched the ships disappear into the horizon. The realization hit him like cold iron. They were alone. The settlers found traces of the old fort from the 1585 expedition. Weathered timbers, collapsed palisades, the ghosts of the first colony's failure. Grass had swallowed the huts. The air was heavy, silent, as if the land itself remembered. But the colonists, resilient as they were, rebuilt. They repaired the houses, dug wells, and planted corn. They traded with the Croatoan tribe, Manteo's people, who remained friendly. For a brief moment, it seemed peace was possible. Manteo and the promise of peace. Manteo, the native who had once sailed to England, became a bridge between two worlds. He guided the settlers through the forests, showing them which plants were safe to eat, which fish to catch. His tribe brought them food in exchange for iron tools and cloth. White wrote in his journal, "The Croatoans are of gentle nature, ready to pleasure us in all things. They speak our names kindly, and in them we find friendship still." But beyond the Croatans were other tribes, the Khotans, the Dosamona Pukes, who remembered the bloodshed of Ralph Lane's men 2 years earlier. To them, the return of the English meant betrayal renewed. At night, the settlers heard distant drums echoing across the water, building a new home. Still, the colonists worked. By late July, they had rebuilt a small village, a stockade, a few wooden homes, and gardens planted in neat rows. White organized councils. He urged cooperation, peace, and order. The settlers listened, but hunger already crept through their days. The soil was poor and the heat relentless. When the fishing failed, they turned to Manteo again, who brought word from Croatoan Island. There was food there and safety, but it was too far to move everyone without ships. White decided he would sail back to England for supplies, as Grenville once had. He promised his daughter he would return before winter. The birth of Virginia Dare. Before his departure, something miraculous happened. On August 18th, 1587, Eleanor Dare gave birth to a daughter, Virginia Dare, the first English child born in the New World. The birth brought joy and renewed faith. The settlers gathered singing hymns under the stars. They believed her birth was a divine sign that the colony would survive. White wrote, "This child born to a world so new is the first of her kind, and perhaps the sign that God doth favour our enterprise." 3 days later, he christened her in the warm Atlantic air. She would become a legend, the spirit of Roanoke, the symbol of innocence lost to time. White's departure. By late August, White prepared to return to England. The settlers begged him to hurry back with supplies. They feared the tribes, the storms, and the uncertainty of winter. White's heart was torn. Leaving his daughter and granddaughter on that isolated shore was agony. But he had no choice. The colony's survival depended on England's ships. Before he departed, he made an agreement. If they were forced to move, they would carve the name of their destination on a tree or post. If danger threatened, they would carve a cross above the name. Music, it was a simple system, one that would later haunt history. On August 27, 1587, White boarded the ship Lion and set sail. He stood on the deck, watching as the shoreline faded into mist, unaware that he would never see his family or the colony again. England at war. White's return voyage was swift, but when he reached England, chaos awaited. Music, the Spanish Armada was assembling to invade. The Queen demanded every available ship for defense. Raleigh and his backers were forbidden from sending expeditions overseas. White pleaded with the Admiralty, but no one would listen. England's survival came before his colony. It would be 3 long years before John White could finally secure a ship to return to Roanoke. By then, it was already too late. Music hope is the strongest sail a man can carry, but even hope cannot calm the storm of nations. Prologue. The Waiting Years. 1587 to 1590. The colony that dreamed of beginning a nation became instead its first unsolved mystery. For 3 years, England was consumed by war. The Spanish Armada darkened the English Channel, and every ship that might have carried food to Roanoke instead carried music, cannon, and powder. John White lived those years in restless torment. Each night he imagined his daughter, Eleanor, standing by the shore, her child in her arms, scanning the horizon for sails that never came. He wrote in his diary, "Each day I see her face in dream, and in each dream she calls my name, not in anger, but in silence." He begged Sir Walter Raleigh for help. Raleigh, now under suspicion at court, promised assistance, but was powerless against the Queen's orders. England's survival depended on defeating Spain. When the Armada finally fell in 1588, the kingdom rejoiced. Bonfires blazed across the land, but to White, the celebration felt hollow. He thought only of Virginia Dare, his granddaughter, now a toddler in an untamed wilderness. The return voyage. It wasn't until March 1590 that White finally secured passage aboard a privateering expedition. 2 small ships, Hopewell and Moonlight, bound to the Caribbean to raid Spanish treasure fleets. White pleaded with the captains to stop at Roanoke on their way. They agreed reluctantly, though their true purpose was profit, music, not rescue. The voyage was cursed from the start. Storms lashed the ships, and the Moonlight nearly sank near the Azores. Music food ran low. The men grew mutinous, complaining that detouring to the Lost Island was folly. Still, White persisted. He promised them that gold or jewels might await among the settlers' remains. By the time they reached the Outer Banks, it was August 1590, exactly 3 years since his departure. The Island of Echoes. The ships anchored off the coast of Roanoke at twilight. Thick fog clung to the water. The air was heavy with the smell of salt and rot. From the deck, the men could see faint outlines of the island's trees, black against the blood-orange sunset. Music White's heart pounded. He looked for signs, smoke, light, movement. There was nothing. They fired a cannon to announce their arrival. Silence answered. As night fell, they saw a strange glimmer deep in the forest, music the faint glow of firelight. The sailors cheered. Perhaps the colony still lived. But as they rowed toward shore, waves smashed against the sandbars. The smaller boats were nearly destroyed. They turned back, deciding to wait until morning. When dawn broke, the fire was gone. The shore of the missing. On August 18th, 1590, the 3rd birthday of Virginia Dare, White and a small crew rowed ashore. They waded through the reeds and onto the sandy clearing where the fort had once stood. At first he thought they had come to the wrong place. The settlement was gone. The wooden palisades were dismantled. The houses were stripped, their timbers missing. Grass and vines crept through the earth where homes had once stood. The silence was absolute. No birds, no wind, no sound of life. Then he saw it. Carved deep in a weathered tree trunk in bold Roman letters was the word Croatoan. Nearby on a second post they found another inscription. Crow, as if the message had been interrupted. White dropped to his knees. His men looked on in unease. He searched frantically for the cross symbol they had agreed upon years earlier, the sign of danger. There was none. This, he told himself, meant they had moved willingly, perhaps to Croatoan Island, home of Manteo's tribe, 50 miles to the south. But the evidence around him told a darker story. The evidence inside the ruins. White found a few scattered items. A rusted musket barrel, a broken chest, and torn remnants of books and maps. All valuable items, iron, tools, weapons, were gone. He found no bones, no signs of massacre, no graves. The fort's walls had been carefully dismantled as if by human hands, not destroyed, but taken apart. Whoever had left Roanoke did so deliberately, methodically, and without panic. And yet they had vanished without a trace. The storm. White urged the captains to sail south to Croatoan immediately. But as they prepared to depart, the weather turned. A massive hurricane struck the Outer Banks, tearing through the coast. Waves higher than the masts pounded the ships. Anchors snapped, sails shredded. One of the smaller boats was lost entirely. White was thrown against the rail, breaking 2 ribs. When the storm finally passed, they found themselves miles off course, their supplies nearly gone. The captains refused to risk returning to Roanoke or sailing further. They declared the voyage over. White begged, wept, pleaded. He offered his share of plunder, his life itself, but the sea was merciless and the sailors were men of greed, not faith. They turned the ships homeward to England. The man who returned alone, John White, arrived back in England in October 1590, defeated, hollow, and alone. He reported his findings to Sir Walter Raleigh and the Queen's court, but few cared any more. England's interests had shifted to trade in the East and colonization in Jamestown years later. The Roanoke venture was seen as failure, a foolish dream. White retired to his small home in Devon, where he spent the rest of his life haunted by the same question: where were they? His final letter reads, "I know not to what end they be gone, yet I trust in God they live still. If they perished, it is in silence, and I with them in memory." No record exists of White's death. He vanished from history, much like his colony did, quietly, inexplicably, and forever. The aftermath, theories and whispers. For centuries, historians have struggled to explain the disappearance. Some believe the settlers fled to Croatoan Island and joined Manteo's tribe, intermarrying, surviving through adaptation. Others suggest they journeyed inland, seeking new land and safety, only to perish in the wilderness. There are tales of pale-skinned children seen among native tribes. Decades later, archaeologists have found fragments of 16th century pottery on Hatteras Island, miles from Roanoke. Evidence perhaps that some survived, but the proof is scattered, incomplete, and elusive. And then there are the darker stories, whispers of witchcraft, starvation, madness, and sacrifice. The forests of the Outer Banks are vast and unyielding. Many who have searched there claim to hear faint cries or see ghostly lights moving among the trees. Even now, on stormy nights, locals say you can hear the faint sound of a child laughing on the wind. Virginia Dare, the first English child born in the New World, calling across 4 centuries of silence.